Okay, so we continue with our discussion of racial formation and racial projects. And let's recall a central idea behind racial formation is that the state, the government that is, plays a decisive role in the social creation of different racial groups within a country. But at the same time, members within those groups often contest or negotiate those definitions that were thrust upon them, leading to new definitions emerging from that. Uh, Sometimes those attempts to contest those definitions are successful in, to use the word destroy, right? Omi Winant's term, destroying those racial categories. But sometimes they're not successful and racial categories persist. Okay, so we'll discuss two particular cases in the 1920s that kind of highlight this dynamic. That's the Ozawa case and the Thin case, two Asian Americans that contested various racial formations that they felt did not apply to them. Okay, at stake here was citizenship, right? The right to be naturalized as an American citizen. Okay, so we are discussing here, to be more specific, racialized citizenship. And as we'll see, and I'm sure you already know because we've discussed aspects of this, such as the quote, aliens ineligible for citizenship. Citizenship and the right to be naturalized as a U.S. citizen has been determined by race. In other words, it's racialized citizenship until fairly recently in U.S. history. Okay, so if we go to the beginning of U.S. history, that's to say, after the ratification of the Constitution in 1789, the policymakers and politicians, lawmakers, they had to decide who could be naturalized as a U.S. citizen. Okay, now that there's such a thing as the United States of America. By the way, this reminds us that nations, as well as race and gender and what have you, are social constructions before, 1776, and some argue before the Constitution, 1789. The United States did not technically exist, right? It was created. In any case, these policymakers had to arrive at conditions that would allow a person who is born outside the country to be eligible for citizenship, to be naturalized. So what they came up with in 1790 is included in the 1790 Naturalization Act. And two conditions were listed. Number one, you must be white, so race, of course, figured into this. And number two, you must be free, which means you can't be a slave. Okay, so I just mentioned, right? Race is a determining factor in terms of who could be uh, part of the country. That is to say, national belonging, because that's what citizenship is. And to add to this, at that time, at least in 1790, the early 1800s, the United States was the largest republic in the world. Okay, republic meaning ruled by the people. Most other areas and empires were exactly that, empires ruled by monarchs or emperors, what have you. The United States was a democracy ruled by the people, right, which is a republic. And that's why citizenship was felt to be a crucial issue because citizens could vote. Citizens are involved in self rule, right? They could even run for office. So the prevalent belief in 1790, as with into the 19th century, and indeed into a lot of the 20th century, was that only whites could really practice the quote art of democracy. Okay, and many of them qualified that further. Only Anglo-Saxon and Northern Europeans, right, are the standard bearers of democracy in a republic. Okay, so therefore, it doesn't surprise us that in 1790, the founders of the country required that anyone who could be extended citizenship must be white. Now, a little bit of backdrop that's not on this slide. Some changes would happen because African Americans, well, when they were enslaved, they were denied citizenship, and this was actually enshrined in a famous court case, Dred Scott decision, right? The Dred Scott decision, which basically said all persons of African ancestry are not citizens of the U.S. But then, once the slaves were set free, the U.S. did indeed extend citizenship for all ex slaves, and this happened through the 14th Amendment, which provided birthright citizenship for all Americans. Okay, that was the letter of the law. The spirit of the law, so to speak, was the granting of citizenship to, again, African American ex slaves, now free persons. Okay, so we jump forward to the Chinese in the West Coast, and here's something that we discussed, right? Aliens ineligible for citizenship. And by the way, when Congress was debating whether or not to extend citizenship to persons who were not white, namely ex slaves of African descent, well, the issue did emerge in the debate in Congress. Well, what about the Chinese on the West Coast? Well, that was automatically dismissed, right? You can imagine saying, no way, okay, come on. It's obvious that Orientals, so to speak, cannot be extended citizenship because, racially speaking, right, they are far removed from, the white race, okay? But we also discussed this, the Wong Kim R case, okay? And the Wong Kim R case, well, let's recall that Wong Kim Ark was a Chinese American. He was born on U.S. soil. But with the earlier issuance of aliens ineligible for citizenship, he's denied citizenship, even though the 14th Amendment automatically guarantees birthright citizenship, right? So he felt that this was unconstitutional, and indeed he pursued it through the court system, went all the way to Supreme Court, and in 1898 the Supreme Court agreed with Wong Kim Ark, all right, that persons of Asian descent should indeed be extended citizenship if they're born on U.S. soil. By the way, it's important to note this. Um, any immigrant or first generation, so to speak, they are denied citizenship rights or naturalization rights, to be more precise. Okay, they cannot be naturalized into citizenship. All right. Okay, so this brings us to two court cases, Supreme Court cases, that were pursued by Asian Americans. And let me give you a little bit of backdrop to these cases. First of all, notice the decade here, the 1920s. The 1920s was a high point in nativism in the U.S. Okay, nativism, of course, meaning anti-immigration. So what's happening here is many Anglo-Americans, that is to say, Americans of English descent, were anxious about the fact that there were so many Europeans coming over from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, Italians, Greeks, Russians, Hungarians, Polish, and not to mention immigrants from the Middle East and, of course, from Asia. Now, many of these immigrants were not considered white. For example, Italians were not considered white by Anglos at that time. Okay, you may have even heard this: the Irish were not considered white. Nonetheless, many of these immigrant groups tried to pursue naturalization so they could become citizens. Why? Because, of course, citizenship entails, privileges and advantages, of course. And many of them just wanted to be part of the United States. But let's also recall the 1790 Naturalization Act. You must be white. So what about an Italian, let's say in, I don't know, 1890, right? If he argues that he is white, how's the court going to arrive at a decision? Let's say a person from the Middle East, let's say from Syria, how is the court going to decide that this person originating from Syria is white or not white. And of course, the whole issue of citizenship hinges upon the court defining what is white or what is not white, right? Okay, so this led the courts to appeal to two sources of knowledge about race. The first source of knowledge is the science of race at that time. You had various scientists and anthropologists endeavoring to classify people based on skin color and other physical traits. And they believed this was a natural classification, just like it's natural to classify, mammals and various living organisms. You may have heard of classifications such as Caucasian. This is where the term Caucasian arose from, which is still used today, right? It came from the science of race. So there's the Caucasian, they use the word Negro, Malay, and Mongolian, for example, all right? Now, another source of knowledge was something that was actually unscientific, and that's, quote, common knowledge, unquote, or even common sense. That is to say, right, what category does that person belong to, racially speaking, based on common sense? Okay, so here you literally interpret skin color. Oh, that person is white because look at their skin. It's white. It's not brown. It's not red, quote unquote. It's not yellow, right? It's not black. It's white. Okay, so again, common knowledge or common sense. By the way, some courts use both science of race and common knowledge in a single legal decision. Okay, so that's how complicated it is by the 1920s. Okay, you have to think about the fact that all these immigrants are pursuing naturalization, but you have this 1790 Naturalization Act stipulating that you must be white, but at this time, what does that mean, right? And therefore, the courts are deciding it. Again, this is a racial project. It should be clear to you, right, according to our definition. Okay, so the Ozawa case is pursued by this Japanese person, Takao Ozawa, in the 1920s. And here's a picture of Takao Ozawa. Looks very assimilated, obviously. And Ozawa described himself as a person who was thoroughly assimilated, right? A paragon of assimilation. He lived in the U.S. for 28 years, graduated from UC Berkeley. He severed all his ties to Japan and chose to speak English only and favored Japanese. In fact, he schooled his children in an American school, no Japanese school, didn't teach them Japanese, just English. So he filed for naturalization rights in 1914 at first, okay? But he lost this pursuit in the lower courts. But at the same time, he doggedly pursued his case for years until it reached the Supreme Court. Now, when the court got hold of this case, here's Ozawa appealing to common sense in his right to be naturalized. That is to say, his skin is literally white, and not only that, he's thoroughly assimilated, as I described. So how is the court going to decide based on those, conditions, right? Is he white? Well, the court arrived at the decision that denied Ozawa, namely because they appealed to science. Okay, they appealed to the fact that he belongs to the Mongolian scientific racial classification, not the Caucasian. In fact, you could read this opinion from the Chief Justice George Sutherland. Quote unquote, the federal and state courts have held that the words white person were meant to indicate a person of what is popularly known as Caucasian. Okay, meaning that the lower courts tended to appeal to common sense. However, the Supreme Court says that Mr. Ozawa is clearly of a race which is not Caucasian and therefore belongs entirely outside the zone on the negative side. So, in other words, the Supreme Court is denying common sense, right, and appealing instead to the science of race, and therefore denying Ozawa his claim towards citizenship.